Hello again, everyone. This is an overview of some of the moral questions surrounding performance-enhancing drugs. I think I mentioned at the end of my last lecture, which was kind of a Unit 2 overview on this, that I was thinking about I might just do a lecture focusing mostly on Torbjörn Townsjo's article about the ethos of elite sport, or putting it differently, the kind of spirit of sport and how that's related to performance-enhancing drugs. But I thought about that more, and he's really only talking about one or two critical questions in this area. And given the breadth of what we're talking about, I thought it would be better if I tried to kind of basically just give my own take on this particular issue, surveying a number of the different arguments that come up in the readings. Now, you may not agree with my kind of diagnosis of the ongoing debate, and that's fine. You're welcome to defend your own position in the essay questions on your exams, or potentially at the end of the term in a big lengthy paper. No problem. But this is an issue that when I first taught it a year ago, first incarnation of this course, I hadn't really thought much. I knew a little bit about the debate, but I hadn't thought much about it beyond the extent to which a casual sports fan would probably think about it, because the two sports I follow are mostly tennis and basketball, and there are issues with performance-enhancing drugs in those sports, but they are not prominent issues. I'm sure it would have been different if I was, say, a fan of a sport like baseball, where performance-enhancing drugs there's been a huge spotlight on that in recent history. Or if I was a fan of the Olympics, right? If I followed the Olympics really closely, that would be another context where concerns about performance-enhancing drugs are really prominent. But now it's been, this is now my third time teaching about these issues. I've had some time to think about this and some time to kind of reflect on the quality of some of the different arguments that are in play. So let's start by just thinking about the basic questions that are at stake in the debate. One of the big questions is, should any performance-enhancing drugs be illegal to use in athletic competitions? Or, conversely, should we just allow athletes to use whatever substances they want to prepare for their, tournaments, games, whatever they happen to be? Related, what would be the moral basis for prohibiting the use of performance-enhancing drugs? What would be the rationale for making PEDs illegal or legal? You can't really answer the first question without also answering the second question, right? If you were to answer the first question yes, people would say, okay, well, why? And if you were to answer the first question no, people would ask you why. And to answer that question, you're going to have to answer the second question. And then there's also the third question, which we're not going to hit on as much in the readings for this week as the other two. But it's still important, and if it's something that interests you, I would encourage you to think about it for a term paper topic. Third question is, how can we differentiate between what substances are permissible to use in athletic competition from those that aren't? So it's widely believed, for instance, that coffee is an acceptable substance that you can take. Like, nobody's testing for whether someone has had a cup of coffee before they go out on the court, or before they or the field, or whatever the venue is, right? No one cares. But people might test you for anabolic steroids, say. Well, both of those substances in different ways can enhance your athletic performance. So what's the rationale for caring about one of these substances but not the other? What's the relevant difference between those two substances? So that's a question that we'd also have to be able to answer if we're going to resolve this issue on the whole. Now, what I'm going to basically do over the course of these slides is just run through a series of different arguments. All of them have the same structure. These are all proposed reasons to ban certain types of drugs. So they're all going to have the structure, performance-enhancing drugs should be banned because blank, right? And this first one is because their use constitutes cheating. And this is obviously true because in a lot of contexts, it's illegal to use performance-enhancing drugs. It's a violation of the rules. This, however, is not a good argument. It is an extremely superficial argument. It's not good because we have the means of changing the rules of competitive sport. So if you point out to someone that using PEDs is cheating, they can just say, well, yeah, under the current set of rules, but the relevant question we should be asking is whether those rules are justified. We should be asking the question, do we want to change the rules to make it so that the use of PEDs no longer constitutes cheating? So all that this argument really accomplishes is just pushing the dialogue back a step, right? Because we're still going to have to investigate the question of whether or not the rules which make it illegal to use PEDs are justified in themselves. It's very similar to why, if someone said you did something wrong and you ask them why, and they say, well, you broke the law, you might say, well, how do you know it was a just law, right? Or how do you know that the basis for the law is consistent with morality? And until we answer that question, right, the fact that you broke the law does not give us any, indication of whether what you did is morally wrong or not. Here's a different argument. This one is super common, comes up a lot in not as frequently in the academic literature on this subject, but very commonly in the more popular non-academic venues where this issue gets discussed. Performance-enhancing drugs should be banned because they pose some kind of significant risk to athletes' health, or they're, as Jacob Beck puts it, they're unsafe in some meaningful way. This, I think, is also a bad argument. I'm not convinced that at least any version of this argument that I've seen is really very persuasive. Now, for this one, I think there are two problems. The first one is the statement is simply not true of all performance-enhancing drugs. There are some performance-enhancing drugs that do pose really significant health risks. But there are also a lot of performance-enhancing drugs that don't, that have extremely minor side effects, if any at all. And so, if you're going to go in for this argument, then I would say that the argument's going to be pretty limited, because you're hinging your rejection of performance-enhancing drugs on an empirical claim about their effect on athletes' health. So if we have a performance-enhancing drug that doesn't pose that kind of health risk, you'd have to, on the grounds of consistency, say that that drug was permissible to use, right? So that's going to give you a very, you're going to have a very narrow range of drugs that you're going to be able to ban using this rationale. The other problem, which is one that's emphasized by several of the authors that we are reading this week, is that athletes routinely subject themselves to significant health risks just by competing in their sports. A football player routinely risks concussions and other kinds of injuries just by participating in a high contact sport like that. Basketball players risk twisted ankles, torn Achilles tendons, various kinds of other, there are some historically nasty injuries involving fluky falls after people go up for an alley-oop or something like that. And even non-contact sports like track or tennis or things like that, just the repetitive motion and movement and the strain of the movement on the body can lead to some really significant injuries, both short-term and long-term. Here's the problem. We don't think that athletes subjecting themselves to those health risks is objectionable. We think that's perfectly fine. So if it's perfectly fine for them to risk their health in that context, why is it not permissible for them to risk their health through the use of performance-enhancing drugs or similar supplements? It looks like we're being inconsistent. We're saying to athletes, well, you have the freedom to put your health at risk in this way in the context of your sport, but not in this other way. And at least at face value, it just looks arbitrary. It looks like it just looks like we're sort of splitting hairs here and not being consistent. And also, to an extent, not respecting athletes' autonomy, right? We're limiting the ways in which they can try to improve their performance in ways that, again, because it's based on risk to athletes' health, it just looks totally arbitrary. An athlete might well say, look, I accept the risks of playing my sport, and you're okay with that, why are you not okay with me accepting the risks associated with using steroids or using some other supplement? That question needs some kind of a compelling answer, and I've not seen one presented in the literature. Now, here's an argument that Jacob Beck considers briefly. He dismisses it pretty fast because I don't think this is a particularly strong argument either. Performance-enhancing drugs should be banned because athletes who use performance-enhancing drugs do not deserve credit for their accomplishments. So, as I sort of alluded to, I don't think this is a particularly good argument either. First, one of the things that Beck points out, performance-enhancing drugs are not magical. They don't enhance your ability unless you put in some kind of work. So, I've used steroids a couple of times as an example. If you take that supplement, it improves your ability to put on muscle mass, but it's not going to help you if all you do is sit on your couch all day. It's not like your muscles just magically get bigger over time just by taking the supplement. If you're using the drug EPO, which increases your red blood cell count, that could theoretically help you to run faster because you can process more. Your blood can basically carry more oxygen to your lungs and elsewhere through the body. But that's really not going to matter a whole lot if you never do any actual training to take advantage of that increased capacity and to improve your respiratory fitness in other ways. So that's one response. Just to point out that you still got to put in the work, even if you're using performance-enhancing drugs. The other thing that I would point out is that performance-enhancing drugs are not like a substitute for the development of skill or strategy. So part of being good at a sport like basketball is certainly just having the athletic ability to compete at a high level. But you also need to be, skilled in various ways. You can be super strong or very fast, but you could be, if you're really uncoordinated and you don't have good ball handling skills or good shooting touch, you might still not be a very good player. And you also have to understand strategy. So you need to know when the appropriate time to help on defense is, or you need to know how to make a read out of a double team and figure out which pass is going to get your team the best shot. Those kinds of things are not going to be accomplished by taking performance-enhancing drugs. That's the kind of thing you're only going to get from being on the court and trying to develop your abilities, develop your athletic acumen, as it were, for the particular sport. Now, to be fair, there are some sports that don't seem like they involve those kinds of elaborate strategies. If you're an Olympic athlete competing in the 100-yard dash, this is no knock on runners. Maybe there's more to it than I'm aware of. I played some college tennis and played basketball a little bit as well in high school, but track was not something I ever got into at any kind of high level. But running a 100-yard dash, to me, at least on the face of it, looks like a sport where it really is just a matter of your ability, like just your raw athletic ability and speed. There doesn't seem to me to be a lot of complex skill or strategy that goes into winning a 100-yard sprint, right? The starting gun sounds, you run as fast as you can in a straight line without any engagement with or interference from your competitors. I don't see, so in that context, this kind of response doesn't really work, because you could say, well, actually, performance-enhancing drugs in that particular sport really could make a huge difference in how well you do. So number 2 on this list, I'll admit, is a somewhat limited response in its scope. Now, here's a different argument. One concern about using performance-enhancing drugs is that they reflect a sort of corrupted motivation. So thinking back to our moral theories, this is obviously a virtue ethical argument, right? Because you're questioning the character of the athletes in question. And you're saying, like, what's wrong with performance-enhancing drugs is that athletes who use them are obsessed with beating their competition, and that's not a virtuous disposition. That's the way the argument is supposed to go. Again, I think this is a pretty poor argument. I don't think this is a good reason to reject legalizing performance-enhancing drugs. One reason that I didn't see in our readings, but that seems obvious to me, is that athletes' motives for using performance-enhancing drugs are often going to be way more complicated than that. There may be some athletes who really are just driven obsessively to pursue perfection and to beat their competition. But their motives might be, a lot of athletes are pressured to use performance-enhancing drugs by people around them, right? To gain some kind of an edge. This is especially true if you're an athlete that's right on that precipice of being able to make a living by doing it professionally. If you're somebody who's good, but not elite, right? You're good enough that you have a chance of making it on the pro tour, but not, or of making, the cut for a big professional team, but it's not a sure thing. You may get pressured by people around you to give yourself a little bit of an edge in certain areas by using certain supplements, right? To just boost your performance just that little bit more. It's not obvious to me that an athlete who's, taking a performance-enhancing drug in that situation has some kind of perverse intention. They may just be trying to make a living. Or in extreme cases, they might be not just trying to make a living, but they might be trying to make it professionally so that they can make a fair amount of money to send back to their family. There are a lot of cases of international athletes who come from circumstances of relative poverty and did not have great means when they were growing up and want to be able to give back to their families. So I think that condemning an athlete's character just because they're taking or intending to take performance-enhancing drugs is too quick of a judgment. The other thing that Jacob Beck points out in his reading is that often we admire athletes for their competitive spirit and their sort of internal drive to achieve excellence. And if you listen to some sports talk shows on ESPN, they will talk about athletes, who have that kind of killer and instinct. Or if you're familiar with Kobe Bryant in the NBA, the quote Mamba mentality or something like that, like people who are almost dogmatically competitive and obsessed with being the best and finding ways to beat their competition. We often praise these kinds of athletes. We view that as kind of an essential feature of the competitive spirit. So it's questionable whether this sort of motivation, that we started with up at the top, is actually a vicious motivation. It seems like there are at least some contexts where it's a praiseworthy motivation. All right, so the first four arguments were all, like I basically said, I think these are pretty weak arguments. I don't think these are good reasons to, make performance-enhancing drugs illegal. Now we get into some arguments where the waters get a little bit murkier and where it's I think, more up for debate whether the arguments are good or bad. So here's one. Performance-enhancing drugs should be banned because allowing their use constitutes unfairness. So the thought here is that by allowing certain athletes to use performance-enhancing drugs, those athletes are getting an unfair advantage over other athletes. My take on this argument is that I am not sure whether this is a good reason to ban performance-enhancing drugs or not. I just kind of sketched the reasoning behind the in favor of a ban position. But there's a second side to this, which is captured in some of these replies. So sometimes athletes using performance-enhancing drugs, this is a restatement of what I had said earlier. The second side of this is reflected in the second point here. Performance-enhancing drugs often are cheaper than many of the advanced training methods that serve as alternatives to them. So in the article primarily authored by Julian Savulescu, he and his co-authors talk about EPO and how it is a much cheaper way to increase your essentially your respiratory fitness than high altitude training or the the acquisition of a machine that simulates high altitude training. The machine is very expensive, and some people, depending on where you live in the world, may not have access to just going up in the mountains and engaging in high altitude training. All three of these things, the two training methods in EPO, they are all basically designed to increase the effectiveness of your red blood cells of carrying oxygen around your body. EPO does it by essentially just increasing your red blood cell count. And the other two methods create the same overall effect, but not as a result of just taking a drug that does it directly. So the question there is, this is just one case, but I think it's important because it'll generalize to other contexts. If you're an athlete from socioeconomically disadvantaged circumstances and EPO is not available to you, you may not have the means of engaging in those other training methods, and so you're kind of screwed. There's no way for you to advance compared to your competition in this particular way. You're kind of stuck, and that kind of situation arises in other contexts as well, where, as a matter of empirical fact, the performance-enhancing drugs are actually an economically more viable alternative than some of the other more expensive methods. And so if the main objective is to make sure that everyone is kind of on a level playing field for competing, there are some contexts where legalizing performance-enhancing drugs look like it would improve fairness, because it would give some of these people who are kind of getting the short end of the stick here in other ways, it would give them an additional option for how they could enhance their training. The other thing to consider here is whether or not fairness is really a central objective of sport. I don't have it on here because this is a sort of bigger picture kind of potential response, but sports have a certain degree of inherent unfairness. So every single person, every one of us, we have certain things that we are kind of innately talented or gifted at, and certain things that we are not. So maybe you're blessed with good hand-eye coordination, which makes you better at a sport like tennis or golf or baseball than somebody might be. Maybe you have a genetic disposition to put on muscle mass faster than other people. So you've got an advantage in a sport like football or powerlifting or whatever. Maybe, the same thing holds true in an intellectual context too, right? Some people have certain subjects that they have a greater aptitude for than others. But the bottom line is, nobody is really starting from the exact same place. We all have already some inequalities that are built into our performance, right? And our ability to train effectively for certain things. So one of the questions to ask is fairness really a central value of sports? Is it really something that we care about to this extent, right? And even if it is, there's the further question: do performance-enhancing drugs really undermine fairness so much that they should be banned the way that they are now? I think these are tough questions. This is why I kind of have the verdict listed as uncertain. I'm not sold that an appeal to fairness is a good reason to ban performance-enhancing drugs, but I'm not ruling out that a version of that argument could be successful. Now, argument number 6 on the list. This is the Jacob Beck argument. This is the arms race concern. So, arms race is the phrase he uses. Here's the idea. Performance-enhancing drugs should be banned because allowing them to be legal would generate a vicious arms race among athletes to obtain the best performance-enhancing drugs. The reason it's an arms race is because basically Beck envisions the legalization. He's talking primarily about steroids in the article. In fact, almost exclusively about steroids in baseball. The idea, his concern is, if you allow steroids to be legalized, then what's going to happen in professional baseball is there's going to be this never-ending search to try to develop the best performance-enhancing drug to make you stronger for the purpose of hitting more home runs, right? And that's going to result in a sort of perpetual game between athletes and their, I guess, their personal pharmacist, as it might be, to figure out how to best improve performance, not through increased training, not through new, creative strategies or anything like that, but just through making a better drug. And Beck is concerned that that's not fundamentally what sports should be about, right? Sports are designed to test people's athletic aptitude and ability. And if sports become more about the underlying, drugs or supplements that are used to change and alter people's natural athletic ability, if that's the primary thing that sports suddenly become about, then we've lost sort of one of the central values of athletic competition. And then he says there's only really one way to prevent the arms race from taking place, and that's to ban the relevant substance before the arms race can get off the ground and get going. This is another argument that I'm a bit uncertain about for one simple reason. I actually think it could be a very strong argument if the empirical claim that it's based on winds up being true. But I'm not sure if it's a guarantee that legalizing performance-enhancing drugs in general, or steroids in particular, would automatically lead to this kind of vicious arms race that he envisions. I definitely see it changing some things, right? Because it would create a market, right? A legal market for athletes to try to procure performance-enhancing drugs. But I also wonder if there wouldn't be a sort of upper limit on this, right? At a certain point, performance-enhancing drugs would encounter kind of a problem of diminishing returns, which means, there might be a drug at, when it first starts, right? There might be a drug that's really, really good, much better than all of the other drugs. But eventually there would be knockoffs. There would be imitators. There would be similar versions of that same drug that get produced. And eventually all of the drugs that are available would be very close in their overall effectiveness. And at some point, that would happen for all variations of performance-enhancing drugs. And then the question is, well, would there be any further innovations or any further new types of drugs that come out that raise the bar any higher? And my suspicion is at some point there's going to be a cap, there's going to be a limit, a point at which the performance-enhancing drugs don't really make much of a difference anymore compared to the ones that were already in existence, right? Like the new ones, in other words, won't be that much better than the previous ones. And at that point, it seems like this investment in the arms race will no longer be the most effective way for athletes to increase performance, right? That it'll be back to improving performance primarily through unique training regimens or better or superior coaching or something like that. So I'm not sold that this claim is true. And unless I'm presented with some kind of additional information that makes me confident that it is true, I wouldn't be willing to invest my stock in banning performance-enhancing drugs on this argument. Now, there's one more to cover, and the Torbjorn Tonsdo's article is entirely about this one argument. Performance-enhancing drugs should be banned because their use in some way or another undermines the spirit of sport, or as he puts it, Tonsdo puts it, the ethos of sport. Now, I am not sure if this is a good argument or not, but I think this is the most promising argument for trying to find a general reason to oppose the use of performance-enhancing drugs. The reason I think that is because this argument anchors itself in our understanding of why we value sports, right? And it tries to pin our valuing of sports to a certain set of values and norms that are inconsistent with the legalization of performance-enhancing drugs. Now, there is, of course, a question, how exactly does this sort of argument work? And so I'm going to try to lay out in this last slide, kind of how I think such an argument might succeed. First, here are some of the reasons why we value sports. I don't know if this is an exhaustive list or not, but these are the things that come to mind for me. A few of these Tanzjo talks about in his own article. One of the obvious reasons we value sports is for entertainment value. We value sports in part because they're fun to watch. It's fun to see people compete. The uncertainty of the outcome is also something that people really like. This is why we have sports betting and things like that. We also admire sports sometimes just for its aesthetic qualities, just for what athletic excellence looks like in its purest form. This is why, people buy posters of people making diving catches, in the end zone in football, or dunking on someone in basketball, or maybe like a really nice action shot of someone hitting a certain tennis or something like that. We admire the athletic qualities that are demonstrated in competition like this. Another thing we value in sport is fair competition. I think this really is something that we just kind of value for its own sake. We value the ability to put our skills to the test against someone else, and in an environment where the rules are consistently applied to both parties, and just see who emerges victorious, right? This is one of the same reasons why we like to play games, competitive games against one another, right? It's just sort of a kind of ubiquitous feature of human social groups. We like to compete in various ways. Something about the way we're psychologically hardwired that makes that an enjoyable and valuable practice in our societies. I also think we value athletic achievements in themselves. Right, so some sports are more obsessive about looking at records than others. But in almost every sport, there is this extensive list of both individual and team-oriented achievements, and I think we value these achievements in part just because of what they represent. Like we just value athletic excellence for its own sake, in the same way that we value intellectual excellence and artistic excellence and other forms of excellence as it manifests in different contexts, right? There's just something impressive about athletic accomplishments in themselves. And the last one, I think we value sports in part for their narrative value, right? We value sports in part because of the story that they tell. This is one of the main reasons why you have so many cheesy movies, right, focusing on some kind of like underdog sports story of some sort, right? It's also why when we see sports in real life professional contexts, we often have certain athletes or teams that we're rooting for. Now, granted, there are some people who are just sort of like dogmatic fans of they grew up in a particular part of the country and they just root for the same team because that's where they grew up and that was just a sort of social norm. I'm not really talking about those people. I'm talking about people who get, maybe you get attached to a particular athlete in a way that they conduct themselves, in a way that they're the story of how they came to be in the league and how they became successful, or the story of how a team got to be that way, and you get invested in that, and it's the narrative that you care about. Now, before I move on, what I want to propose here is some of these things look like they're consistent with performance-enhancing drugs, but not the legalization of performance-enhancing drugs, but not all of them. To get an idea of that, think about like entertainment value. I think that if we allowed for performance-enhancing drugs, I think in most contexts, the entertainment value of the sport would not be hindered, right? In some ways, it might just make it better because we'd see even more spectacular play or athletic achievement. When it comes to fair competition, again, I'm not sure, at least, I mentioned fairness in a previous slide as being kind of uncertain, but I can at least see ways in which, as long as the rules were consistently applied to all people and stuff, you can at least imagine how the legalization of performance-enhancing drugs could be compatible with fair competition. And as far as the aesthetics go, it might depend a little bit on what enhancements we're allowing people to use. If we start allowing people to use 9-foot robot legs so that they can compete in the high jump, we might have a problem on a number of levels, that genuinely might diminish like the aesthetic value associated with the sport, as well as and it also might. I'm not sure what that would do to entertainment value. It would certainly be an interesting spectacle, but it would kind of feel to me like I'm not sure we're really watching like a sport anymore. You know, we're watching like a bunch of cyborgs jump really high. I don't know. We're getting kind of like to meta questions about what sport even is. But point being, I can imagine several of these categories that are consistent with the legalization of performance-enhancing drugs, at least a fair number of performance-enhancing drugs. But I think that the one that they would have the hardest trouble being consistent with would be the narrative value of athletic achievement. There's something about knowing that an athlete took performance-enhancing drugs that tends to alter our perception of those people. And not necessarily in a way where, like, I mean, there are some people who just look down on the person's character, but I don't really mean in that way. I mean, we look at the achievement differently, right? We think that there's something better about achieving a particular feat on your own natural aptitude rather than with the use of performance-enhancing drugs. And I think it's hard to pin down exactly why, like what's driving that intuition or what value underpins it. The closest that I've come up to this point in figuring out exactly what might explain that intuition is that there is something fundamentally, I think, more satisfying for us in understanding that what we were able to achieve or do was a result of things that were within our own control. Right, that we're an expression of our own aptitude and ability, rather than something that was a result of taking a substance to help us achieve the end outcome. So think about it in terms maybe of, well, you all just took an exam. Let's imagine that before you took that exam, you were able to take some kind of a special potion. And the potion for, 2 hours, let's say, would dramatically improve your aptitude at philosophy for like 2 hours. But it would only be a temporary effect. You'd lose the benefit after it was over. Now, if you took that, so you take that, you ace the test, you get like 100%, whatever. But then you come back and you realize, oh, well, I don't actually really even remember why I answered these questions that way because I'm not under the effects of that drug anymore. Now, this is an extreme case, and there are some dissimilarities to how actual, physically enhancing drugs, right, would work. I know this is a cognitive case we're talking about. But my suspicion is that you might look at your exam score there and you might not feel as satisfied with your 100% as you would if you took the exam without taking the drug and scored 100% that way. I think in that second case, you would feel far more satisfied with your achievement. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that you would have done something wrong, like something morally wrong. We'll get into that cognitive enhancement debate next week. I'm not necessarily saying you did something morally wrong there if you did take that kind of drug to do well on the test. But the point is, the way that you obtained this particular achievement seems to be somehow like the story has changed in a way that doesn't seem good, right? It seems like something of value has been lost by altering the narrative that way. And I think the same kind of thing might be going on with these athletic achievements. Like knowing that a person accomplished some great feat with the assistance of performance-enhancing drugs, in some way, now, I do want to be clear, because we had, I don't remember what number it was, but I think it was it 3? It was 3. I do want to be clear here. I'm not recasting this. Oh, why'd you do that? There we go. I'm not recasting this argument. I'm not saying that you don't deserve any credit for your accomplishment, right? I'm not saying that athletes who took performance-enhancing drugs don't deserve any credit for what they did. right? Or any of the training or whatever. That's not the argument. My point is that the origin of their success has changed in a way that alters the narrative that underpins their success. And the narrative seems to have shifted to me in a way that makes us look at their accomplishment differently and makes us look at that accomplishment as being less valuable than it was before. Now, maybe that's unfair. Maybe we shouldn't make that judgment, but I find that very hard to shake. I find it very hard not to view these success stories that involve the use of these substances as in some way different than success stories that don't involve their use. Now, an earlier slide I mentioned I'm still not totally sure whether this is a good argument. The reason why is I'm not yet totally convinced that my sort of intuitive grasp of what's going on here is correct. I wonder a little bit if this isn't just, if on reflection, this isn't going to just wind up being sort of an inconsistency in my reasoning. Because one of the issues here is, how would you differentiate what substances alter the narrative in a negative way from ones that don't? Because we're always going to be taking, whether it's even if it's not a performance enhancing drug that's banned, pretty much everybody's drinking some kind of replenishing substance of some kind, a sports drink, vitamin water, other sports drinks, whatever else. Pretty much everybody is doing some kind of training or something to enhance ability, which involves, input from experts and other professionals. Everybody's engaged in certain things that are in some sense, altering their natural aptitude and ability with the help of others. Why is it that something that comes from this particular source is bad or objectionable? I don't have a great answer to that question yet, and that's why I'm still not totally sold, even on my own argument. My hope is that by the end of this academic year, I will try to have, my hope is that I'll be able to put this into some kind of coherent argument and maybe write it up as something that I could send out somewhere. But I haven't gotten that far yet. I'm still working on it. Because the follow-up question, if this account were accepted, would be, how does this tie in to a rationale of what performance-enhancing drugs are objectionable and which ones aren't? And if it can't provide that kind of rationale, we're sort of back to square one, because you're just kind of left with wondering, like, okay, so what we've established is there might be some substances that change the narrative value of sports in an objectionable way, but which substances are they, and why is it just those substances and not others? If you can't give us an answer to that, then it just looks like this criteria is going to wind up being kind of unacceptably arbitrary. And so it might be theoretically, promising, but in practice, we couldn't use it to actually develop and defend an account of which performance-enhancing drugs should be permitted and which ones should be banned. So there is still work to do, even if you found the story I just told attractive. I think there's still work to do in figuring this out. But there's, as you can tell, we've gone through 7 different arguments here. There is a lot of room to talk about different perspectives on this issue. One thing I will point out, even though I marked several of these arguments as bad arguments, one project you could consider for a term paper is taking one of these arguments that's, well, this one I'm pretty pessimistic that you could change this, because like I said, it's just sort of fundamental. Like, the question really just is, why are the rules justified? I don't see how you could really make a full term paper that would be interesting about this. But arguments 2, 3, and 4 on this list, even though I marked them as bad arguments, you might try to take one of these arguments and see, can I come up with a better version of this argument that's not vulnerable to these kinds of objections, right? Could I make an argument based on athlete safety that's better than the versions of the argument that I saw in the readings? Could I come up with a better version of the argument that athletes who use PEDs don't deserve credit for their accomplishments? Could I come up with a better virtue ethical argument for how using PEDs is not consistent with what a virtuous athlete would do? I think those would be interesting projects and worth pursuing if you're interested in this particular issue. So, on that note, I will leave you. We'll be discussing more of the complexities of this stuff in class this week. Also, some of these bigger picture issues about motivations and about how we differentiate between acceptable performance enhancement and unacceptable performance enhancement. Some of these same kinds of issues are going to come up again next week when we talk about cognitive enhancement, and I'll actually spend some time going over kind of some of the similarities between the two debates that are going on about these two different forms of enhancement. So I will see you in the next lecture.